The water is
41
cool
fathers.
today, girl.
That is how many
Peace
men's
be upon
names
you
you
all.
have to read before you reach the carpenter at the end of Matthew's first chapter. 41 names in 3 perfect columns of 14. Patriarchs, kings, and then at the end a column of men
We accept
nobody
your
has ever
terms.
heard of, ending
And so
at
the
a
union is
carpenter in a
blessed.
village too
To the
small to
Kiddushim,
matter.
to our
Matthew
families.
1:16.
With this cup,
And Jacob
and before
begat
these
Joseph, the
witnesses,
husband of
I
Mary,
pledge
of
myself.
whom was born
It is
Jesus.
signed.
That is how
And
the
so it
line
is done.
ends. With a man whose own voice is never recorded once in the entire New Testament. A man whose ancestors wore crowns
Be
of
it
gold.
unto me,
A man who by
according to
every
your
measure
word.
of ancient Jewish royal law was the rightful heir to the throne
Do
of
not be
David.
afraid, Mary.
And he was making yokes for farmers.
My
Think
soul
about that for a
glorifies
moment.
the Lord.
The man who in a different timeline would have
Father?
ruled an empire was
It's
in
me.
this timeline charging 6 denarii to fix a neighbor's broken plow. The man who carried the bloodline of Solomon, builder of the temple, was hammering door frames in a village so small you could walk
Joseph,
across it
son
in
of
7
David,
minutes.
do not fear
How
to
does
take Mary
royalty
as your
become
wife,
sawdust?
for that which is conceived
How does
in
a
her is from the
1,000-year
Holy
bloodline end in a one-room
must go.
workshop in Galilee? And what was Joseph carrying that nobody around him could see?
Now,
Tonight we walk the road that made him. Through every broken crown, through every forgotten father, through every silent generation, until we reach the workshop where a king became a carpenter and we finally understand what he had been waiting for his entire life. Let's go inside. To understand what
welcome,
Joseph
friend. What can I
carried
do
you
for
first,
A manger,
have
Joseph,
to
for
understand
Bethlehem.
what a
Yes, of course, let's
genealogy
find the right wood.
was.
It should be sturdy
In
but
the
gentle.
first
I understand.
century
I will plan it
Jewish
carefully.
world, a genealogy was not a curiosity. It was a deed. It was the document that proved who you were, what tribe you belonged to, what land your family could claim, what role you could fill in the temple, and for one specific bloodline, what throne you had a right to sit on. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, tells us
The
that the
decree of
temple in
Caesar Augustus.
Jerusalem kept
A
public
summons for all to
registries
return to
of
their
these
family
lineages.
lines, to the place from
Families
which they came
could trace their
for the
descent.
census.
Priests could prove their lineage back to Aaron. And the descendants of David, the royal line, could in theory point to
road
the
is long,
documents
Mary.
that said
Stay
who they
strong.
were.
I will,
Joseph was on one
We
of
must
those
keep going.
lists. Matthew 1:1, the book of the
Landing for the
generation
first
of
time in
Jesus Christ,
centuries.
the son of David, the son
The
of
house of
Abraham.
David.
Notice what
Yes.
Matthew does in his very first sentence. He does not begin with Bethlehem. He does not begin with an angel. He does not begin with a star.
Welcome
He
home, my
begins with
son.
a deed. Because before
has been
Matthew
too
can
long,
tell you
Uncle.
about a
The
child,
journey
he
was
has to
hard,
tell you
but we are
about a
here.
line. Matthew structures the list with mathematical precision. From Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the Babylonian exile,
You made
14
this?
generations. From the exile
It's
to the
impossible.
Christ, 14 generations. 42 names, 3 perfect columns, each one ending at a hinge of history. This was not the only way to count. Luke's Gospel gives a different genealogy, longer traced through a different line ending at Adam instead of Abraham. Scholars have debated the relationship between the two lists for 2,000 years. Some say Matthew gives Joseph's legal line and Luke gives Mary's. Some say Matthew traces the royal succession while Luke traces blood descent. We will not solve that debate tonight. What matters is this. Matthew wanted you to see the pattern. 14, 14, 14. He skipped some names. He had to make the math work. He left out several kings whose names are recorded in the Old Testament. This was not deception. This was a literary device. Ancient genealogies were structured for memory, not for spreadsheet accuracy. Matthew was telling a story with names, and the story he was telling was simple. The rise, the fall, the hidden return. The first column is the rise. The patriarchs, the shepherd kings of the desert, men who lived in tents and built altars out of unhewn stone. Abraham, who was promised a land he never owned. Isaac, who was nearly sacrificed on a mountain. Jacob, who wrestled an angel and limped for the rest of his life. Judah, who fathered the tribe that would carry the royal
Abraham,
promise. Genesis
Isaac,
49:10, the scepter
Jacob,
shall not depart from Judah.
Judah,
That single sentence,
you are
a
a
dying
lion's
patriarch's
whelp, Judah.
blessing on his fourth
Your
son,
brothers shall
became the
praise you.
architecture of
The
everything
scepter
that
shall not
followed.
depart from
A
you.
scepter given verbally with no throne attached. A king promised to a family that had no kingdom. It would take 400 years before that scepter became a sword. Another 400 before that sword became a throne. And another 400 before that throne would shatter into pieces small enough to fit inside the grain of a Galilean carpenter's workbench. Remember that image, a fragment of gold leaf pressed into ordinary wood. You will see it again, 5 more times before the story is over. Before we walk into the second column, there is something nobody talks about. Matthew includes 4 women in the genealogy. 4. In a culture where women were almost never named
The line
in royal
continued through her
lineages,
despite the
in a
violence done to
culture
her.
where
Single
ancestry
figure,
passed strictly
Bathsheba,
father to
the
son,
woman Matthew
and the
refused to
women were
name.
assumed but never written. Matthew names them anyway. Tamar, a widow who disguised herself and slept with her father-in-law Judah because he had refused to give her his 3rd son in marriage. Rahab, a prostitute from Jericho
and
who
I will
hid
give
the
your
Israelite
flesh to the
spies
birds of the
and
air.
was spared when the walls fell. Ruth,
Did you see that?
a foreigner from Moab, a nation
Why the
Israel
youngest?
was forbidden to marry
Surely
into,
not him.
who married a Bethlehem farmer named Boaz, Bathsheba. Matthew does not even use her name. He calls her the wife of Uriah, refusing to let the reader forget that David had her husband killed. Why are they here? Because the line of David was never clean. It was never pure. It was never what a first-century rabbi would have called respectable. Matthew is doing something deliberate. He is telling Joseph and every reader that the bloodline he inherited had already absorbed scandal foreignness,
What
widowhood,
portion have we
and
in David?
grief.
We have
The
no
royal
inheritance
line
in the
was
son
not
of
a
Jesse.
museum piece.
To your tents, O
It was
Israel.
a living thing that had passed through the hands of women whose stories would have been whispered, not celebrated. And here is what that meant for Joseph. When the angel told Joseph in his sleep to take Mary as his wife, a woman pregnant by no human father, a woman whose situation in the eyes of the village would look exactly like Tamar's, exactly like Rahab's, exactly like Bathsheba's, Joseph already had a template. His own bloodline had been built on women like her. 4 times before in his own family tree, God had used a situation that looked like scandal to advance the line. 4 times before a woman who should have been cast out had been brought in. Joseph did not need to invent a new theology to accept Mary. He just had to read his own genealogy. The crown of David was already, by the time it reached Joseph, a crown that had been carried by women the world tried to forget. Matthew refused to let them be
Jesse,
forgotten.
then David,
And
Solomon,
Joseph, in his own
Rehoboam,
quiet
Abijah.
way,
We
took up
remember
that
their
same
names,
refusal
so we do not
the night he
forget who we
chose
are.
not to put Mary away. There is one more thing about these 4 women that almost no one points out. 3 of them were foreigners
See that
or
edge
had
there?
ambiguous origins.
It needs to be smoother for the
Tamar
oxen.
was
I will
almost
see to
certainly
it.
a Canaanite woman. Rahab was a Canaanite from Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite. Bathsheba had been married to a Hittite Uriah, and some traditions hold that she herself was of mixed ancestry. Matthew is telling you in the very first chapter of his gospel that the line of David, the bloodline of the Messiah, the most exclusive royal line in Jewish history, was always already mixed, was always already foreign, was always
How can
already
we sing the
gathering up the
Lord's
people
song in a foreign
God's
land?
enemies thought he
If I
had
forget
rejected.
you, O
The
Jerusalem.
Messiah was not going to come through a pure line. The Messiah was going to come through a line that had been deliberately woven generation by generation
Remember the names.
out of the very
Abraham,
people the religious
Isaac,
establishment of every
Pass this light
century
on. I
would
will,
have wanted
Father.
to exclude.
I will remember the names.
Joseph carried that
These are the
knowledge in
names
his
of our
blood.
ancestors,
And when the
stretching
time
back 10
came for him to make a
generations.
decision
You must
that the
remember
village
them,
would never
for they are the
understand
foundation of
taking
our
in a
family.
pregnant
Do you
girl
think
whose
Caesar
story
fears
made
dirt
no
under
sense.
fingernails?
He had 1,000
You
years
are
of precedent behind him.
dismissed.
His fathers had been doing this for generations, taking in the people the world tried to push out, grafting them into the line that pointed toward the king. He was
must
just the
perfect
next
this
father to
cut.
do it. The second column is the kingdom.
The morning
It
light
begins
aids your
with
hand.
David, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers.
Shalom.
The one
Yosef
his
ben
own
Yaakov.
father almost
Shalom.
forgot to
How may
introduce
I help
when
you?
the prophet Samuel came looking. David, who killed Goliath in a valley, who played the harp for a maddened king, who hid in caves for a decade while Saul hunted him, who finally took the throne at 30 and held it for 40 years. 1 Samuel 16:13. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him. That oil, a small amount of olive oil
Abraham,
mixed with spices,
Isaac,
poured from a
Jacob,
horn
Judah,
onto the head of a
Perez,
teenager in a
Hezron,
Bethlehem
Aram,
courtyard,
Aminadab.
became the founding
time
act
is
of a
not yet
dynasty.
right.
David became
Rest
king.
here
David
until the
fathered
next generation
Solomon.
comes.
Solomon built the temple.
Good day, friend.
The
My
temple
plow
stood
broke.
for
Can you
almost
fix it?
4
Let me
centuries.
see. It will take
And
2
the throne
denarii
that
to mend
began
this
with a
properly.
shepherd
2
boy
it is. Here you
passed
go.
down son to
The work
son
of
for
our
20
hands.
generations. Solomon's reign
Daily
was the high point.
faithfulness.
The temple
Building
gleamed
what
with
is
gold.
needed.
Foreign queens came to see the splendor. The kingdom stretched from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. And the men who worked the
Baruch
gold,
atah
the
Adonai
craftsmen, the
Eloheinu
tectons,
melech
the
haolam,
carpenters of
asher
Jerusalem
kitshanu
were among the most
b'mitzvotav
skilled in the
v'tzivanu al
ancient
divrei
world.
Torah.
Imagine the scene.
Your house
A
and your
carpenter
kingdom
in
will
Solomon's
endure
workshop,
forever
kneeling
before
on a
me.
marble
Your
floor,
throne
pressing a
will be
paper-thin
established
sheet of
forever.
gold leaf onto a cedar beam. The leaf is so thin you can see your finger through it. The leaf is so fragile that a breath of wind can lift it away. The leaf is the most precious material the kingdom can produce, and it is being applied one
I made
fragment at
this,
a time by
and I
hands
still
that are
like it.
trained to be careful. Somewhere in that workshop, a flake of gold leaf came loose. It drifted to the floor. Someone perhaps swept it into a corner, or pressed it into the wood it had fallen against, or carried it home in the cuff of a tunic without ever knowing. The crown was already beginning to break. The kings were not all
The doorway
good.
from the outside.
Matthew did not curate the
Just
list.
a door.
He did not edit
Just a
out the
lintel.
failures.
Just a
The
house.
list includes some of the worst rulers in the history of the ancient Near East. Manasseh, who filled Jerusalem with idols,
The water is
and
cool
according
today, girl.
to 2 Kings
Peace
21,
be upon you
shed
all.
innocent blood in the streets until it ran from one end to another. Ahaz, who burned his own son as a sacrifice. Rehoboam, who lost 10 tribes in his
We
first
accept your
decade
terms.
because he
And so the
refused to
union is
listen to
blessed.
advisors
To the
older than
Kiddushim,
himself.
to
It
our
also
families.
includes some of
With
the
this
best.
cup, and before
Hezekiah,
these
who
witnesses,
tore down the high
I pledge
places
myself.
and trusted the Lord
is
against
signed.
Sennacherib.
And so it is done.
Josiah, who found the lost scroll of the law in the temple and wept when it was read to him. Asa, who burned his own grandmother's Asherah pole.
Be it unto me
Jehoshaphat,
according
who sent
to your
priests
word.
to teach the Torah from town to town. And here's the thing that the second
be
column
afraid,
tells you
Mary.
when you read it slowly. The
My
good
soul
kings and the wicked
glorifies the
kings
Lord.
sit in the same column, side by
Father?
side, with no commentary.
It's me.
The murderer Manasseh and the reformer Hezekiah are listed the same way in the same script with the same word begat, connecting them to their fathers and their sons. Matthew is not writing a moral commentary.
Joseph,
He is
son of
writing a
David,
deed.
do not
He
fear
is
to take
showing
Mary
you
as
that
your
the
wife,
line moved
for that which
forward
is
through the
conceived in
wicked,
her is
the
from the
same
Holy
as
Spirit.
through the righteous.
I must go.
The throne passed through Manasseh because Manasseh was the heir. The throne
Now-
passed through Hezekiah because Hezekiah was the heir. The blood did not care which one was holy. The blood only cared that the line continued. That is one of the strangest mercies in the Bible. God did not require a clean line. He required a continuous one. And he kept it continuous through 50 years of Manasseh's idolatry, through Ahaz's
Welcome,
child
friend. What can I do for you?
sacrifice,
A manger,
through
Joseph,
Rehoboam's
from Bethlehem.
foolishness,
Yes, of course. Let's
through
find
every
the right wood. It
failure
should
the
be sturdy
second
but
column
gentle. I
records.
understand. I will plan it
And
carefully.
yet, they are in the line. They are in the line because God did not work through a clean line. He worked through a real one, a line full of murderers, idolaters, fools, and failures. A line that when you trace it from Solomon to the exile looks less like a royal succession and more like a slow 400-year fall. The crown
decree of
was
Caesar
breaking,
Augustus.
and the
A
bloodline
summons
was
for all to
breaking with
return
it.
to their family
Most
lines,
people
to
have
the
heard
place
the
from which
story
they
of
came,
David.
for the
Most
census.
people have heard the story of Solomon. Most people have at some point listened to a sermon about the kings of Judah. But almost no one knows what happened
The
to the
road is
crown.
long, Mary.
In the ancient
Stay
Near East,
strong.
royal
I
crowns
will,
were
Joseph.
composite.
We must
They
keep
were made
going.
of layered gold leaf over a wooden frame,
Landing for
set
the
with
first time
stones
in
decorated with
centuries.
engravings. They were
The House
also
of
fragile. They cracked. They broke. They had to be repaired, remade, refitted sometimes more than once in a single king's reign.
Welcome
Every
home, my
time a
son.
piece broke off, every time
It
a
has been
flake
too
of
long,
gold
Uncle.
leaf came loose,
The journey was hard,
every time a
but we are
jewel
here.
popped from its setting, that fragment had to go somewhere. And for 400 years of Davidic kingship, the crown was breaking and being remade, breaking and being remade. The pieces
You
went
made this?
everywhere. Into priest vestments,
It's impossible.
into temple repairs, into the dowries of princesses, into the pockets of corrupt officials, into the workshops of craftsmen who melted them down and reused the metal. The crown of Judah was in some real sense dispersing into the bloodstream of the kingdom long before Babylon ever arrived. And then Babylon arrived. In 587 BC, after a long siege, the army of Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls of Jerusalem. The Temple of Solomon, the building that had stood for almost 4 centuries, the building that contained the gold of David's dynasty, was burned to the ground. 2 Kings 25:9. And he burnt the house of the Lord. 6 words. The end of an era. The end in a real sense of the line of David's kingship. The last reigning king of Judah, Zedekiah, watched his sons killed in front of him. Then they blinded him. Then they marched him in chains to Babylon, where he died in prison. The Davidic dynasty, by every visible measure, ended in that courtyard. The crown broke. The gold scattered. The line scattered. And here is where Matthew's 3rd column begins. Not in a palace, not in a coronation. In a prison camp in a foreign country where the descendants of the kings of Judah became ordinary slaves. But the line did not end. The exiles kept their genealogies. They kept their memories. They kept
Abraham,
their identity. And
Isaac,
70 years later, when Cyrus of
Jacob,
Persia conquered Babylon and let the
Judah.
Jews go home,
You are a lion's
the descendants
whelp,
of
Judah.
David walked back
Your
to
brothers shall
Jerusalem
praise
along
you.
with everyone
The
else.
scepter shall
They did
not
not return
depart
to
from you.
thrones. They returned to ruins. They rebuilt the temple, but it was smaller, so much smaller that Ezra 3:12 says the old men who remembered Solomon's temple wept aloud when they saw the foundations of the new one. They rebuilt the walls, but the kingdom was gone. They rebuilt their lives, but as subjects of foreign empires. And the descendants of David quietly became craftsmen. Somewhere in those years, a craftsman descended from kings was finishing a yoke for a farmer in a Judean village. And as he set the brace into the bow of the yoke, he tucked something into the wood. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was an old family habit passed down for generations of putting
The line
one
continued
small
through her
thing into
despite the
every
violence
piece
done
of
to her.
work. One
Single
small
figure,
thing that
Bathsheba,
no one else
the
would
woman
ever
Matthew
see.
refused to
A
name.
flake of gold, a fragment of a crown, a memory. The farmer never knew. The ox never knew. The village never knew. But the craftsman knew, and he taught his son. 14 generations.
Come to me, boy.
From the
and I will
Babylonian
give your
exile
flesh
to
the
Joseph,
birds of the
14
air.
generations, and almost none of them are recorded
Did you see
anywhere else in Scripture.
Why the youngest?
The Old Testament does not mention
Surely
them.
not him.
The histories of the period do not name them. They are the family Matthew preserved in a column on the day everyone else had forgotten them. This is the longest stretch of the genealogy by years. Roughly 600 years separate the exile from Joseph's birth. In those 600 years, the line of David lived through Persian rule, Greek conquest, the Maccabean revolt, Hasmonean kingship, and finally Roman occupation. The descendants of David, the men who in a
What
different
portion have we
timeline
in
would have been
David?
kings during
We
all
have
of
no
this,
inheritance in
became
the son of
ordinary
Jesse.
people.
To your
They
tents,
worked
O Israel.
trades. They lived in villages. They paid their taxes to a series of foreign rulers, Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, and eventually Romans. They became, in a word, invisible. And here is the thing that almost no one notices. Matthew preserved them anyway. For 14 generations, a family that had once worn crowns made yokes, and someone, some father, some uncle, some grandfather in the line kept the list, kept the memory, kept passing down to his sons the strange, increasingly impossible seeming fact that they were by blood kings. You can imagine the scene. A father in some Galilean or Judean village in the long, quiet centuries between the prophets and the angel sitting his son down on a winter evening, pulling out a small scroll, tracing the names, saying quietly without ceremony, "These are your fathers. This one was a king. This one was a
Jesse,
king.
then David, Solomon,
one was a
Rehoboam,
king.
Abijah. We
This
remember
one
their
was a
names,
craftsman
so we do
like
not
you will
forget
be."
who we are.
The boy would not understand perhaps what he was being given, but the names would stay in him, and one day he would teach them to his own son
See that
for
edge there?
14 generations.
It needs to be
How
smoother
did
for the
Matthew
oxen.
know
I
these
will see to
names?
it.
We do not know. The temple registries had been destroyed by the time Matthew was writing, burned along with the temple itself in AD 70. The official records of the Davidic line were ashes, and yet Matthew gives us a complete column, 14 names, each one begetting the next, a continuous chain through 600 years of darkness. Most scholars believe Matthew had access to family records. The descendants of David in the first century were still
How
a
can we
known
sing
group.
the Lord's song in a foreign
Eusebius,
land?
the early church
If I
historian,
forget you,
tells
O
us that
Jerusalem.
Domitian, Roman emperor in the 90s, actually summoned 2 grandsons of Jude, the brother of Jesus, to Rome for questioning.
Remember the names.
He had
Abraham,
heard there were
Isaac,
still Davidic
Jacob.
claimants in
Pass this
Galilee.
light on. I
He
will,
wanted to
Father.
see them.
I will
When
remember
he saw
the
their
names.
calloused hands and
These
their
are the
small
names of our
farms, he
ancestors,
laughed and let them
stretching
go.
back 10
The line was
generations.
still being
You
tracked.
must remember them,
The
for
names
they
were
are the
still being
foundation of our
remembered.
family.
Someone
Do you
in
think
Joseph's
Caesar fears
family had
dirt
kept
under
the list.
fingernails?
Someone in his
You
great-grandfather's
are
family had
dismissed.
kept the list. Someone 600 years earlier, sitting in Babylon, had kept the list. That is what the third column means. Not a record of
I must
kingship,
perfect this cut.
a record of fidelity, a record of 14
morning light aids
generations
your
of
hand.
fathers who refused to let the names disappear, even when the names had
Shalom.
become
Yosef ben
inconvenient,
Yaakov.
even when
Shalom.
claiming to be
How may I
descended from
help you?
David could get you killed by a Roman emperor. For 14 generations, the line was kept alive by candle and whisper, by bedtime stories, by the patient act of a father on a winter evening pulling out a small scroll and tracing the names, until the list reached a young carpenter in Nazareth named Joseph. But here is what makes the genealogy
Abraham,
strange.
Isaac,
If you read the second
Jacob,
column
Judah,
carefully, the
Perez,
column of
Hezron,
Kings, you notice something
Aram,
unsettling.
Aminadab.
Matthew
The
has
time is
chosen
not yet
deliberately
right.
not to clean the list up.
Rest here
He includes the
until
murderers.
the next
He includes
generation
the
comes.
idolaters. He includes the kings
Good day,
who
friend.
lost the
My
kingdom
plow
through
broke. Can
pure
you fix it?
foolishness.
Let me see.
He
It will take
includes
2 denarii
Manasseh,
to mend
who,
this
according
properly.
to 2
Do it
Kings,
is. Here you go.
filled Jerusalem
The
with
work
so
of our
much
hands.
innocent blood that the city had to be
Daily
punished for his
faithfulness.
sins alone.
Building
He
what is
includes the
needed.
kings whose names later rabbis would refuse to speak in synagogues. And then he ends the column with a strange phrase. Matthew 1:1-1, Josiah begat Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. Jeconiah, a king who, according to Jeremiah 22:30, was cursed by God. The prophet said, "Write this man down as childless. None of his offspring will sit on the throne of David." A king cursed in the very line that was supposed to produce a Messiah. How does the throne come back through a man who was forbidden to give it? That is the question that haunts the third column. And to answer it, we have to walk back into the wreckage of the second column, the wreckage of the kings, and look at what was actually being passed down. Not the crowns, the cracks. By the time Joseph reached his middle 20s, the line had been quiet for so long that almost no one in Nazareth would have known he was royalty. His neighbors called him Joseph the Carpenter,
the doorway
Joseph,
from the outside,
son of Jacob, Joseph of the small workshop on the third street from the well. They did not call him Ben David, son of David. They did not call him Heir. They did not call him anything that hinted at the genealogy he carried in his bones.
Peace be upon you
but
all.
Somewhere in his small house on a high shelf in a small wooden box, there was a scroll. The family genealogy, the list of names, the 41 fathers who had brought him to this morning in this workshop in this village.
We accept your terms.
He knew the names
and
by
so
heart.
The union is blessed.
Every Davidic descendant did. They were drilled into the children of the line the way Torah was drilled into every Jewish boy. The names were recited at Sabbath meals. The names were whispered at funerals. The names were how the line proved in a temple court, if it ever came to that the bearer was who he claimed to be.
Be it unto
But Joseph had never had to prove it. The temple court had never called him. The throne had never been offered to him.
Do not be
the
afraid,
crown,
Mary.
whatever was left of it, had never been
My
placed on his
soul
head.
glorifies the
He
Lord.
just kept the scroll. Joseph
Father?
knew who he was, but
It's
knowing
me.
who he was did not change what he did with his hands. Because here is the thing about a 1,000-year inheritance. It does not pay the rent. It does not feed the household. It does not give you any standing in a village that has no
Joseph,
memory
son
of who
of
your
David,
ancestors
do not fear
were.
to take Mary as your
Joseph
wife,
was the
for
heir
that
of
which is
David, and his
conceived in her
work
is
was
from the
wood.
Holy Spirit.
He was a
I
tekton,
must
the Greek
go.
word the Gospels use for him in Matthew 13:55. We
Now.
translate it carpenter, but the word covers more than wood. A tekton was a craftsman of building materials. Wood, sometimes stone, sometimes both. The kind of man who could be hired for a small job in the village, or who walked the 4 miles north to Sepphoris for a larger contract. He was paid in small coins. He took what work he could get. He kept his books on a
Welcome,
scrap
friend.
of
What can I do
parchment.
for you? A
He
manger,
paid his
Joseph,
Roman
for Bethlehem.
taxes.
Yes, of course. Let's
He
find the right
paid his
wood.
temple
It should be
tithe.
sturdy but gentle.
He
I
bought his
understand. I will
bread
plan
from
it
the
carefully.
same neighbor every week. And once a week on the Sabbath, he sat in the back of the small Nazareth synagogue and listened to the same scrolls being read that mentioned the kings of his bloodline. Hearing the name David, hearing the name Solomon, hearing the name of his own ancestor read aloud in the same room where no one knew the man, 2 benches behind them was the heir.
The decree of
The
Caesar
rabbi
Augustus,
reads 2
a summons
Samuel
for all to return to their
7:16,
family
and
lines,
thine
to
house
the place
and thy
from which they
kingdom
came,
shall be
for the
established
census.
forever. The promise to David, the promise of an eternal throne, the promise that by every measure of ancient Jewish royal law
The road is
belonged to the
long, Mary.
man in the
Stay
third
strong.
row of the back
I will,
bench.
Joseph.
And
We must
Joseph
keep
does
going.
not move, does not whisper,
Landing
does not
for the
glance
first
at his
time in
neighbor,
centuries.
does not in any way indicate that
house
the
of
promise
David.
being read is
Yes.
in some sense addressed to him. He had been carrying this for so long that the carrying had become invisible to him. But here is what I want you to see. The lintel of his own house.
It has
He had
been
put
too
it there
long,
himself.
Uncle. The
A
journey was
small
hard,
fragment of
but
something
we are
his
here.
father had given him the day Jacob the carpenter died and left him the workshop. A flake of gold leaf that, according to the family story, had been in their hands for so many generations
You made this?
that no one remembered which king it had come
It's
from.
impossible.
He touched it every time he came home. No one else knew. Not the neighbors, not the rabbi, not the customers who came to his door for repairs. The fragment was hidden in the wood behind the dust, behind the ordinariness of an ordinary doorway in an ordinary village. But every time Joseph passed under it, the heir of David walked under the broken crown of his fathers. This is what 14 generations had taught him. You do not display the crown. You do not sell the crown. You do not wear the crown. You hide it. You press it into the grain of ordinary work. You let it disappear into the wood. You teach your son where to find it. And you trust that somewhere down the line, the throne will find its way back without your help. That was Joseph's theology. Not preached, not written, hammered. And here is where Joseph's character starts to come into focus. A man who has carried a 1,000-year secret in silence does not become a man who panics under pressure. A man who has watched his fathers for 14 generations take the long view does not become a man who needs the village's approval. A man who has been quietly carrying the broken crown of David in fragments of gold leaf hidden in lentils and yoke braces does not become a man who needs to be seen. He becomes, in the only Greek word the gospel uses to describe him, dikaios, just, upright,
Abraham,
reliable.
Isaac,
The kind of man
Jacob,
who, when an impossible situation lands on
Judah.
his doorstep,
You are a lion's
instinctively
whelp,
chooses
Judah.
the response
Your
that protects
brothers
the
shall
people
praise
around
you.
him at his
The
own
scepter
cost.
shall not depart from you.
This is not natural. This is trained. Joseph did not become this man because of one dream. He became this man because of 41 fathers who had each, in their own quiet way, taught him what it meant to carry something precious in a world that would not understand. Imagine being raised by that line. Imagine being the son of a man who on Sabbath evenings took down a small wooden box and read you the names of 40 fathers who had carried the same silence. Imagine being told from the time you could understand language that the throne of David ran in your veins, and also being told in the same breath that you would never sit on it and that you must never tell anyone about it. What does that do
The
to a
line
man?
continued
It
through
makes
her
him
despite the
patient.
violence done to
It
her.
makes him quiet.
Single figure.
It makes him
Bathsheba,
able to hold
the woman
weight that
Matthew
other men
refused
would
to
drop.
name.
It makes him, for lack of a better word, ready. Ready for what was coming. Joseph saw her at the well. That is how courtship began in a Galilean village. Not in private, not at dinner parties, at the well where
Come
every
to me,
woman
boy,
of marrying age
and I will
made
give
the
your
same
flesh to
walk
the
every
birds of the
morning.
air.
Where the men of the village walking to their workshops could glance, just glance,
Why the
and
youngest?
form the slow, unspoken
Surely not him.
impressions that would eventually become a betrothal. Her name was Miriam. Her father's name was Healy by Luke's account. Her family lived 3 streets from Joseph's workshop. Her cousin Elizabeth lived in a Judean village far to the south in the hill country near Jerusalem. Her family was not wealthy. Her dowry would be modest. She was, by every measure that a first-century matchmaker would have applied an ordinary girl. She was also, though no one yet knew it, the woman the bloodline had been waiting for. The betrothal
What
was
portion
arranged,
have we in David?
not by Joseph,
We have no
not by
inheritance in the
Mary,
son of Jesse.
by their fathers,
your
as
tents,
every
O
betrothal
Israel.
in first-century Galilee was. The Kedushin was the formal first stage of marriage. After Kedushin, Mary and Joseph were legally husband and wife in every way except the moving in. After Kedushin, the second stage, the Nisuin would follow about a year later, when Mary would leave her father's house and come into Joseph's. And in that one small ceremony, Joseph took a step that would have meant nothing to any of the witnesses watching, but everything to the bloodline he carried.
Pull!
He grafted Mary into the
Treasures
genealogy.
are ours!
Whatever child she bore,
To Babylon!
whatever child was carried in her womb during the years of their marriage, would be legally Joseph's son, adopted into his line, inserted into the scroll on the high shelf in the little wooden box. The royal blood of David passed not by biology, but by legal claim. This is how ancient genealogies worked. This is how the cursed Jeconiah
Jesse,
problem
then David,
found its
Solomon,
answer.
Rehoboam,
A child whose
Abijah.
biological
We
father
remember
was
their names,
outside the
so we do
cursed
not
line.
forget who we are.
A child whose legal father was inside the royal line could carry the throne of David without inheriting the curse. Joseph did not know that when he signed the betrothal contract.
I will see to
Nobody did. But the line was being prepared. The crown was finding its final shape. The bloodline was about to receive, through a girl at a well, the one it had been carrying for 41 generations. There is a piece of this that the church has thought about for 2,000 years, and it is worth pausing on. The genealogy of Matthew traces the line through Joseph, but the angel told Joseph the child was not biologically his.
How can we sing the Lord's song
So
in a
how does
foreign
the
land?
throne of David pass
If
to
I
a
forget
son
you, O
who is
Jerusalem.
not Joseph's son by blood? The answer is in the structure of ancient Jewish adoption law. In the first century, a man who
Remember the
legally
names.
claimed a child
Abraham,
by accepting
Isaac,
him into
Jacob.
his household,
Pass
by
this
naming
light on.
him,
I
by
will,
raising
Father.
him as his
I
own,
will remember the
passed his
names.
legal status
These are the
to that
names of our
child fully.
ancestors, stretching back 10
Inheritance,
generations. You
tribal
must remember them,
identity,
for they are the
and for the
foundation
royal
of our
line,
family.
the
Do you
throne.
think Caesar fears
The
dirt
child
under
of a king by
fingernails?
adoption
You
was as
are
much a king as the
dismissed.
child of a king by blood. This was not a loophole. This was the law. The Messiah was going to come into the line of David through legal adoption, through the deliberate, conscious decision of a Davidic heir to claim a child the world said was not his. Joseph's yes was not just personal. It was constitutional. The moment he took Mary into his home, the moment he named the child Jesus, the moment he claimed him in front of the village as his son, the throne of David passed. Without Joseph, the genealogy stops one name short. Without Joseph's adoption, there is no legal heir of David in the third column. Without Joseph's silent decision in a Nazareth workshop, the bloodline does not arrive. The line needed him.
Isaac,
The crown
Jacob,
needed
Judah,
him.
Perez,
The prophecy
Hezron,
needed him.
Aram,
And he
Aminadab.
who had been raised
time
by
is not
40
yet
fathers
right.
to do exactly this
Rest
kind
here
of quiet,
until
costly
the next
act,
generation
said
comes.
yes, without ever speaking a
Good day,
recorded
friend. My
word.
plow broke. Can you fix it?
But before
Let
the
me see.
wedding came,
It will take 2
an
denarii
angel
to mend this
came.
properly. 2 it is.
Luke
Here you go.
1:31.
The work of our hands.
Thou shalt conceive in thy
Daily
womb and
faithfulness,
bring forth a son.
building
The
what is
full
needed.
Annunciation. We will save for another video. What matters tonight is this. Within weeks of that visit, within weeks of Gabriel speaking those words to a teenage girl in a Galilean village, Mary's body began to change.
Amen.
The pregnancy
Your
was
house
already
and your
underway,
kingdom will endure
and
forever
Joseph did
before
not
me.
know.
Your
For 3
throne will
months
be
while Mary went
established
south to
forever.
visit her cousin Elizabeth, Joseph carried on. He worked, he prayed, he passed under his lintel, he touched the gold he could not see. He waited for the Nisuan, the wedding feast, when his betrothed would come into his house. And
I
then
made this,
Mary came home,
And I still like it.
and the village began to count. The decision that came to him was the worst of his life. Matthew 1:19 calls him a just man, dikaios. The Greek word means upright. It means the kind of man whose reputation is built quietly, brick by brick, in a village too small to forgive a single mistake. A just man
The
in Jewish
doorway
law
from the
had 2
outside.
options when a betrothed
Just a
woman
door.
was found pregnant.
Just a lintel.
Public
just
accusation, which would mean Mary's life, or private divorce, which would mean her shame but not her death. Matthew 1:19.
The water is cool today,
He
girl.
was minded to put
Peace
her
be
away
upon you all.
privily. He chose the option that protected her. And then the angel came. Matthew 1:20. Joseph, thou son of David, fear not. Notice the address. Not Joseph the
We
carpenter.
accept your terms.
Not Joseph,
And
son
so
of
the
Jacob.
union is
Not
blessed.
Joseph of
To the
Nazareth.
Kiddushin,
Thou
to our
son
families.
of David.
With this
The angel
cup,
called him
and
by the
before these
title that
witnesses,
nobody in
I
his
pledge
village had
myself.
used for him in his
It is
entire
signed.
life.
And so
For
it
the
is
first
done.
time in 14 generations, somebody from outside the bloodline acknowledged what was inside it. The angel told him what was happening. The
Be it
child
unto
was of
me
the Holy Spirit.
according to your
The
word.
child would save his people from their sins. The child with the angel
not be
implied,
afraid, Mary.
without saying directly
My
fulfill
soul
every promise the
glorifies the
second
Lord.
column of Matthew's genealogy had been
Father?
gesturing toward for
It's me.
1,000 years. And Joseph, who had carried the silent inheritance of David his entire life, said yes. He took the scroll. He destroyed the scroll. The divorce never happened. He took Mary into his home.
Joseph,
he
son
took
of
the
David,
child into
do
his
not
line.
fear to take Mary
He
as your
grafted
wife,
the one
for
the
that which is
bloodline had
conceived
been
in her
waiting
is from
for
the Holy Spirit.
into the very list
must go.
that had been waiting for him. He did not write the name yet. The child was not
No.
yet born. The name had not yet been given. But he looked at the empty space the way a man looks at a doorway he is about to walk through. The third column was about to find its hinge. Think about what was happening that night. For 14 generations, the third column had been adding names. Abiud begat Eliakim. Eliakim begat
Welcome,
Azor.
friend. What can I do for you?
Azor
The manger,
begat
Joseph, for
Zadok.
Bethlehem. Yes, of
Each
course, let's
name
find the right
added
wood.
at the
It should be
bottom by
sturdy
the
but
hand of
gentle.
a father who
I
did
will
not
plan
know
it
whether
carefully.
his son would be the one. Each name a small act of faith that the line still mattered even when no one in the empire knew it mattered. And every father, when he added his son's name, did so with the same understanding. The list is not finished. The line is still waiting. The throne is still empty. Keep the names. Pass them down. The one who is coming will
The
come.
decree of Caesar Augustus.
Now Joseph
A
held the
summons
same
for all to
scroll.
return to their family
He
lines,
looked at the same
to the place
blank
from which they
space.
came,
And
for
for
the
the first
census.
time in 41 generations, the man holding the pen knew that the next name would be the last. The line would not need another
The
father
road is
after
long,
this.
Mary.
The
Stay
list
strong.
was about to
I
find
will,
its
Joseph.
meaning.
We must
The
keep
Messiah
going.
would walk out of the third column the way a guest
Landing for
walks
the
out of a
first time in
doorway he has been
centuries.
preparing for. He did
The
not
house of
weep.
David.
He did not celebrate.
Yes.
He did not call the neighbors. He did what his 14 times great-grandfather would have done. He put the scroll back in the box. He blew out the
Welcome
lamp.
home, my son.
He went to sleep. And in the morning
It
he
has been
walked
too
across
long,
the
Uncle.
village to Mary's
The journey
father's
was
house
hard,
and took
but we
her
are
in.
here.
He never told anyone what the angel had said. Not the rabbi, not the elders, not even as far as Scripture records his own mother.
You made
The
this?
dream stayed in the dream. The
It's
secret
impossible.
stayed in the workshop. And the line for the first time in 1,000 years had its answer. One afternoon, a man Joseph had never met came to the workshop and ordered a manger. He needed it for the lower chamber of his house in Bethlehem, the room where the family animals were brought in at night. The trough was for the sheep and the donkey. It needed to be deep enough to hold straw and grain, low enough for the animals to reach, sturdy enough to last a generation. It was an ordinary commission, a trough for a stranger in Bethlehem. Joseph took the deposit. He started the work. He shaped the stone and wood frame. He fitted the boards. He sanded the edges. The work took several days. Mary, by now living in his house, brought him bread at midday and watched him work in the long quiet of the afternoon. And without thinking about it, the way a man does when he has done the same small ritual 10,000 times, he reached into the small leather pouch at his belt, the pouch he had inherited from his father, the pouch that contained the few remaining fragments of gold leaf that had been in the family for so long. He pressed the flake into the wood of the manger's edge, right at the rim, where no one would ever see it, where the straw would cover it for the rest of its life. And then he loaded the manger onto a cart and arranged for it to be delivered to Bethlehem. He did not know. He did not know that a few short months from now he
Abraham,
would walk that same road himself,
Isaac,
with a pregnant young
Jacob,
wife, for a Roman
Judah.
census,
You are
to a city
lion's
where by
whelp,
prophecy
Judah.
a king was
Your
to be
brothers shall
born.
praise
He did
you.
not know that
The
the
scepter
manger
shall
he
not
had just
depart
finished
from
the
you.
manger with the flake of his ancestor's crown pressed into the rim was destined for a specific stone lower chamber in a specific overcrowded house where a specific newborn would be laid to sleep on his first night on earth. He just made the manger. He pressed the gold leaf into the rim because that is what his fathers had taught him to do. and he turned back to the next piece of work on his bench. And then a decree came from Caesar Augustus. Luke 2:1, all the world should be taxed. A census. Every man required to return to his ancestral town. For the first time in 100 years, perhaps in many hundreds of years, the descendants of David were being summoned by Rome itself
The line
back to
continued through
Bethlehem.
her despite the violence
The
done to
Romans
her.
did not know what they
Single
were
figure,
doing. They were
Bathsheba,
collecting tax
the woman
data.
Matthew
They were
refused to name.
enumerating subjects. They were filling in administrative scrolls. But by some pattern, far beyond their understanding, they had just ordered the heir of David home, to the place where Micah had said the Messiah would be born. The bloodline was
Come
being
to me,
called
boy,
back to its starting
and I will
point,
give your flesh
and the
to the
broken
birds of the
crown, what
air.
was left of it, was about to find its home.
Did you see
The journey was 90 miles.
Why the
For a
youngest?
healthy traveler on foot,
Surely not
it was
him.
4 to 7 days. For a young carpenter walking beside a donkey carrying a woman in the final weeks of pregnancy, it took longer. Every village they passed, Joseph had to manage the same conversation. Where are you from, Nazareth? Why are you traveling the census? Whose family? And here, for the first time in 20 generations, the family had to be named. The house of David. 5 generations earlier, no one would have asked. 10 generations earlier, no one would have
What
cared.
portion have we in
But
David?
now, because of
We
a
have
tax
no
decree
inheritance
from
in
a
the son
Roman
of
emperor
Jesse.
who had
To
never
your
heard of
tents,
Judah,
O Israel.
Joseph had to name himself. And every step south, he was walking deeper into the prophecy his ancestors had been carrying in silence. Micah 5:2. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth. Bethlehem was full of his relatives. For one strange week in the spring of that year, the bloodline of David was physically gathered in one town for the first time since the exile. Hundreds of descendants,
Heave!
maybe more,
The treasures are
all
ours!
of them ordinary, all of them
Babylon!
carpenters and farmers and traders, all of them indistinguishable from any other Galilean or Judean traveler. The broken crown reassembled for a single week in the form of its scattered fragments the people who had carried it across the centuries. Joseph would have heard stories at every door, stories of his fathers, stories of fathers he had only known as
Jesse,
names on a
then
scroll.
David, Solomon,
A cousin in
Rehoboam,
one house
Abijah.
would mention an
We
uncle
remember their
who had been a
names, so we do not
stonemason in
forget who we
Hebron.
are.
A cousin in another house would describe a great-grandfather who had carved a doorway for a wealthy household in Jericho.
See that edge there?
Names from the third column
needs to be smoother
suddenly
for the
had
oxen.
faces
I will
and
see to it.
trades and small remembered stories. The line, which had been a piece of parchment in a wooden box for Joseph's entire life, was becoming for a single week a population. And every one of them was poor. Every one of them was a craftsman or a small farmer. Every one of them had carried the
Abiud,
same silent
Eliakim,
inheritance Joseph had carried,
Azor, Zor,
and every one of them
Zadok,
had done with
Eliud,
it exactly
Eleazar,
what Joseph had done. They had kept the
How
name.
can we sing the Lord's
They had
song in
pressed
a
the
foreign
gold.
land?
They had
If
not
I
told
forget
the
you,
empire.
O Jerusalem.
This is what the third column actually was. Not a line on a page. A people. A scattered people who had kept
Remember
their
the
identity
names.
for 600
Abraham,
years
Isaac,
without
Jacob.
a throne,
Pass this
without
light
a
on.
kingdom,
I will,
without
Father.
any visible
I will
reason to
remember the
keep
names.
carrying the names.
These are the names of our
And for
ancestors,
1 week in the
stretching
city
back
of
10
David,
generations.
they were
You
all in
must
the
remember
same
them,
town
for
at
they
the
are
same
the foundation
time.
of our family.
By
Do you
the
think
order of an
Caesar
emperor
fears
who
dirt
did
under
not know what he
fingernails?
had assembled.
You
The
are
crown, which had broken
dismissed.
into 1,000 fragments across 1,000 years, was for 1 week gathered in one place. And on the night the child was born, the bloodline was as close
must
to
perfect
whole
this
as it had
cut.
been since the day Solomon was crowned. There was no
Morning
space
light aids your
upstairs,
hand.
but there was space downstairs. The same manger.
Shalom.
He had
Yosef
made
ben
it.
Yaakov.
It had taken
Shalom.
months.
How may I
The
help
cart
you?
had wound its way south. The manger had been delivered to this exact relative, a distant cousin of Joseph's father, perhaps a Bethlehem householder who had ordered a new feeding trough. It had sat in this room since the previous winter, holding straw for the family donkey waiting. Still there, the fragment of his father's crown, pressed into the rim of a feeding trough,
Abraham,
in a borrowed lower
Isaac,
chamber,
Jacob,
in a
Judah,
town full of his
Perez,
cousins,
Hezron,
waiting.
Aram, Aminadab.
The labor
The
came
time
that
is not
night.
yet right.
The lamp burned in the wall
Rest
niche.
here until
Mary's
the next
voice rose
generation
and fell.
comes.
The women of the
Good day,
household,
friend. My plow
Joseph's
broke. Can you fix it?
relatives,
Let
women
me see.
he had
It will
perhaps
take
not
2 denarii
seen
to
since
mend this
boyhood,
properly. 2 it
moved
is.
around
Here you
her
go.
with the practiced
work of our
calm of
hands.
midwives in every village of every
Daily
century.
faithfulness,
And Joseph
building
held the door
what is
frame.
needed.
The child was born. Luke 2:7, and she brought forth her firstborn son. In the practice of first-century Jewish midwifery, the father often performed the swaddling. The wrapping was both protective and ritual. It signified the family's claim on the child. It said, "This one is ours. We have him. He belongs." A foster father performing the gesture of belonging over a child whose belonging he had been told about in a dream. And then he laid him in the manger. The heir of David, placed by the heir of David in a manger, made by the heir of David in the city of David, on the night the line came home. 1,000 years of broken crowns, 14 generations of patriarchs, 14 generations of kings, 14 generations of carpenters. The crown was never going to be restored as gold. It was going to be restored as a person. Think about what was happening in that
doorway
room.
from the outside.
Every fragment of the crown
Just
that
a
had
door.
ever broken loose,
Just a
every
lintel.
flake of gold
Just a
leaf
house.
that had been lost when Solomon's craftsmen had pressed gold into cedar, every jewel that had been pried out during the long centuries
The water
of
is cold
decline,
today, girl.
every shard
be
that had
upon
been
you all.
scattered when Babylon burned the temple, all of it had been pointing in its own scattered way to this moment. Not to a coronation, to a cradle, not to a throne room, to a borrowed lower chamber,
accept your
not to a
terms.
procession of
And so the
nobles,
union is
to a
blessed.
small handful
To
of
the
relatives
Kiddushin,
who had welcomed
to
a
our
pregnant
families.
cousin in from the
With
census
this
road.
cup, and
The
before these
bloodline had been
witnesses,
preparing
I
this
pledge
room for
myself.
1,000 years,
It is
and
signed.
Joseph, without
And
ever
so it
knowing
is
what his
done.
father had given him in that small leather pouch, had unknowingly carried the last fragment of his ancestor's crown all the way to the rim of the trough
unto
that
me
would hold his
according
foster
to your
son's head.
word.
It was not a coincidence. It was the shape of the entire
be afraid,
genealogy.
Mary.
41 fathers
My
had each in their
soul
own way
glorifies the
been
Lord.
carrying fragments of something they did not
Father?
fully understand toward a destination they could not see. Joseph was simply the one who got to deliver it, and he did not even know he was delivering it. That is the strangest mercy in the whole story. The carpenter who had pressed the gold into the
Joseph,
manger
son of
months
David,
ago in
do
his
not fear to
Nazareth
take Mary
workshop
as your wife,
had no
for that
idea
which is
that his
conceived
own
in her
son
is from
was
the
going
Holy
to be
Spirit.
laid against it.
I must
The
go.
action was not strategic, it was inherited. He pressed the gold because
Now.
his father had taught him to press the gold. He had been doing it his whole life in piece after piece of work without knowing why. That is what 14 generations of fidelity looks like. You do the small thing your fathers taught you to do. You press the fragment into the wood. You do not see the destination. You do not know which piece will arrive at the king's head.
Welcome,
You
friend.
just
what can I
keep
do for
pressing.
You? A manger, Joseph.
And
For
Joseph, son of
Bethlehem.
Jacob,
Yes, of course. Let's
son
find
of
the right wood.
Mathan,
It
son
should
of
be sturdy but
Eleazar.
gentle. I understand. I will
41
plan it carefully.
generations, removed from Abraham, sat against the wall of a relative's lower chamber and watched the one the bloodline had been quietly carrying for 1,000 years. He did not speak. He never spoke in any of the Gospels. He had carried the genealogy. He had carried the silence. He had carried the broken crown. And now he watched the one who would carry
The
everything
decree of
else.
Caesar Augustus.
Joseph went
A summons
home
for all to
after
return to their
Bethlehem,
family lines,
after
to the
Egypt,
place from which
after
they came,
Archaeology,
for the census.
after everything, the family returned to Nazareth, to the small workshop, to the lintel with the hidden gold, to the ordinary
The road is
life
long,
Joseph
Mary.
had been living
Stay
before
strong.
the angel came.
I will, Joseph.
He did
We
not
must
tell
keep
the
going.
village what had happened. He did not tell them about the
Landing
manger.
for the first
He did
time
not
in
tell them about the
centuries.
shepherds, or the wise men,
house of
or the
David.
dreams.
Yes.
He certainly did not tell them about the fragment of gold leaf pressed into the rim of a Bethlehem feeding trough gold that had passed through the workshops of his fathers
Welcome home,
for
my
40
son.
generations before finally
been too
coming
long,
to rest
Uncle.
beside the
The
head
journey
of the
was
one
hard.
it had
We are
always been
here.
pointing to. He just went back to work. And here is where the story becomes the most ordinary thing in the world, and also the most extraordinary. For the next
You made
18
this?
years, the years Luke compresses into a single
impossible.
sentence, Joseph raised the heir of David in a Galilean workshop. He taught the boy who would be called King of the Jews how to plane a board. He taught the one who measured the heavens with a span how to use a measuring cord. He taught the maker of cedar trees how to read the grain of cedar wood. Every parable Jesus would later tell about builders and foundations, about counting the cost of a tower, about a house built on rock and a house built on sand. Every one of those parables had a vocabulary, and that vocabulary was learned in a small workshop in a small village from a man whose voice the Gospels never record. This is the long invisible payoff of 14 generations. The kings had built the temple. The exiles had carried the scroll. The forgotten fathers had taught their sons the names. And Joseph, the last man in the third column, taught the one the column was pointing to how to be a craftsman. The trade did not skip a generation. The trade was the gift. Joseph never wore the crown. He never sat on a throne. He never gave a speech. He never led an army. He never received a delegation of foreign kings. He never had his portrait carved into a temple wall. He never had a coin minted with his face. He never in his entire life was publicly acknowledged as the heir of David by anyone outside his own small family. And yet, he was the
Abraham,
man God chose to be the
Isaac,
foster father of the king. For
Jacob,
one reason, perhaps, above all
Judah.
others. He
You
had
are a
learned over
lion's
40
whelp,
generations
Judah.
of fathers
Your
what to do
brothers
with
shall
broken
praise you.
crowns.
The
You do not
scepter shall
display
not
them.
depart
You
from
do
you.
not sell them. You do not melt them down. You do not even, in most cases, tell anyone about them. You press them into the small, ordinary things that small, ordinary people use every day. You hide them in lintels and yoke braces and feeding troughs and wedding boxes. You let them rest in the wood. You let them disappear into the grain. And you trust, though you may never see it in your lifetime, that the king they were always pointing to will find them. He will find them in the right room, on the right night, in the right city, at the right hour. This is the lesson of 14 generations. Most inheritances are invisible. Most of the things you receive from your fathers, you will never be
The
able
line
to
continued
display.
through her despite
Most
the
of the
violence
things
done
you
to her.
pass to your children,
Single
they
figure,
will not
Bathsheba,
understand until
the
they are
woman
old.
Matthew refused to
Most
name.
of the holiness that runs through families runs not in coronations and trumpet blasts and recorded speeches, but in the small, patient, almost invisible acts of pressing a fragment of something precious into the grain of something ordinary, and trusting
me,
that
boy,
somewhere down
and
the
I will
line,
give your
the
flesh
king
to the
will find
birds of
it.
the air.
We live in an age that does not believe this. We live in an
Did you
age
see
that
that?
rewards what can be seen.
Why the youngest?
The follower counts.
Surely not him.
The headline, the recorded speech, the visible legacy. We are taught almost from childhood that an inheritance that cannot be displayed is not really an inheritance at all. Joseph reminds us that the most important inheritances are exactly the ones that cannot be displayed. The fragments of gold pressed into the grain, the names whispered on winter evenings, the scrolls kept in small wooden boxes on high shelves, opened only by lamplight, traced only
What
by the
portion
patient
have we in
fingers of
David?
fathers who
We
do
have
not
no
know whether
inheritance
their
in the son of
sons will be
Jesse.
the ones who
To your
finally
tents,
see the
O
meaning.
Israel.
Joseph never wore the crown, but he made sure it got to the one who would. May we, when we are handed our own broken inheritances, the things our fathers carried, the things our mothers whispered, the small fragments of holiness that come down to us through generations we will never meet, may we learn like Joseph to press them gently into the grain of our ordinary work. and to trust that the king is still finding them.